The first Muslim conqueror to invade India was Muhammad bin Qasim, who entered the subcontinent through the sands of Sindh in the 8th century and opened the way to waves of subsequent Muslim incursions. But it was not till the end of the 12th century that Qutbuddin Aibak established the first proper Muslim empire in India. When he founded the slave dynasty, his successors ruled for 100 years before giving way to the Khaljis, who occupied the seat of imperial authority for another 100 years. The 14th and 15th centuries were a period of uncertainty in Indian history and of decline in the prestige and power of the Delhi Sultanate. It is quite possible that had the Sultanate completely collapsed and left a vacuum behind it, a Hindu revival might have taken heart and either driven the alien conqueror out of India or absorbed him within its expansive fold. India was rescued from this suspense and the Muslims from this threat to their supremacy by the adventurous exploits of a descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. A hardy Chagatai Turk by the name of Babur crashed through the northwest frontier and swept everything before his courage and zeal. After a convincing victory over Ibrahim Lodi, the last representative of the tottering Delhi Sultanate at Panipat in 1526, he met the Rajputs, a foe worthy of his steel, at Khanua in 1527 and crushed them in a decisive combat. With the two most dangerous enemies thus disposed of, he proceeded to found the so-called Mughal Empire, one of the greatest and the most brilliant imperial pagans of all history. Babur, the lion-hearted, Humayun, the wanderer, Akbar, the great, Jahangir, the just, Shah Jahan, the magnificent, Aurangzeb, the Puritan. The world has nothing to match Babur and his 5 lineal descendants, who gave India peace and glory and fame for nearly 2 centuries. For the first time, Muslim culture flooded the Hindu land of India. Persian became the language of the court and in conjunction with the Hindu languages gave pith and point to Urdu. Islamic forms of architecture mingled with the Hindu tradition and flowered into the glorious Indo-Islamic art of the builder. The Taj Mahal was born to regale the art lovers of posterity. Under the inspiration of the Persian miniature painting reached the acme of its perfection. In every sphere, from revenue administration to culinary taste, the Mughals set a standard and bequeathed traditions and systems from which the later rulers were not chary of borrowing on a large scale. The Mughals were succeeded by the British, and one imperialist sat in the seat of another. With the advent of the British, and particularly after the mutiny of 1857, the Muslims awoke to the realization of their true position in India. So far, they had either ruled the country or enjoyed the illusion of doing so. The exit of the last Mughal monarch from the throne of Delhi was not only a symbol of their downfall, but also an end to their existence as a separate and dominant group in Indian political life. The British believed that the 1857 uprising had been staged by the Muslims, and this added the discomfiture of retaliation to the humiliation of defeat. For many years, the Indian Muslim community floated in the minatory atmosphere of suspicion. Suffering and impotence, they had not yet reconciled themselves to the changed political conditions, not yet convinced that their innings was played out. They were not very friendly with the Hindus, whom they considered beneath equal privilege. They were distrusted by the new masters, secretly and at times openly humiliated by the Hindus, and disowned by both. They lost their moorings, their confidence, their hope, and for the first time they realized with the anguish of bitterness that they were nothing but a weak, powerless, supine minority. This was the first casting of the seeds of nationalism, the first kindling of a feeling of loneliness and prostration, the first awakening to the need of solidarity. Every political phenomenon is caused by two agents, circumstances and personalities. The circumstances under which the Muslim began to have a glimmering of his nationhood have been sketched in the last paragraph. The man who molded the circumstances or acted with the tide of events was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Born in 1817 in a highly respectable family of Delhi, he entered the service of the East India Company and rose to be a judge. During the mutiny, he did yeoman service for the English by saving many British lives, by refusing to lend his ears to the blandishments and threats of Muslim rebels, and by persuading many petty chieftains to give up their refractory attitude. In 1858, he wrote a pamphlet, Essay on the Causes of the Indian Revolt, in which he attributed the mutiny to British ignorance of the Indian mind. This was a brave thing to do in that dark hour of bias and vindictiveness. In a well-argued narrative, he tried to show that there might have been no revolt had the British rulers been less isolated from their Indian subjects and had they kept in touch with Indian opinion and sentiment through some sort of representative institutions. However rudimentary in character, in his next work, The Loyal Mohammedans of India, he defended the Muslims against the British charge of disloyalty. Retiring from service in 1876, he sat as a member of the Governor-General's Legislative Council from 1878 to 1883. He died in 1898. Sayyid's services to his community may be summarized in three terse phrases: loyalty to the British, devotion to education, aloofness from politics. He preached and practiced loyalty to the British rule. From his speeches, writings, and letters, it is not difficult to read his mind. He based his pro-British attitude on three strong foundations. First, the only way of wiping off the stigma of Muslim instigation of the mutiny was to make friends with the British and thus to make them disabuse their minds of the idea that Muslims were their traditional enemies. He was sagacious enough to realize that British control would not cease in any foreseeable future. It was ordinary common sense to be on good terms with the rulers. In the second place, his sense of loyalty sprang from his reading of the Hindu-Muslim problem. Hindus and Muslims were two unequal nations, and the latter would ever remain a minority in India. Every advance towards democracy would mean the depression of the Muslims under the rule of the Hindu majority. Therefore, he opposed the introduction of parliamentary institutions as well as the increase in the recruitment of Indians to public service by open competition. Such political principles, he said, could only be applied to a country inhabited by one nation. In India, every step towards a representative goal would be one more rivet in Muslim chains. In the third place, he was sincerely convinced of the infinite superiority of the British and European way of life to the Indian or Oriental. In his letters written from London, he paid magnificent, almost cringing tributes to the English and went so far as to declare that in his opinion, Indians were no better than animals and brutes. Such sentiments expressed with frank vehemence disposed of the suspicion that he advocated a Muslim-British rapprochement. For purely political and strategic reasons, his call to the Muslims to cultivate the British and to be faithful to them was not just a matter of making amends for the mutiny or of protecting the Muslim minority against Hindu domination, but a genuine conviction that it was only from and through the British that Muslims could learn to improve their status and to stand on their own feet. His second slogan was, "Devote yourself to education. This is your only salvation." He saw that now that the Muslims had lost their imperial sway over India, they must compete with their other Indians for jobs and preferments. Good education was the only key to political and economic progress. Education was an obsession with him, and records show that he went about his self-imposed task of providing avenues of education to his people with almost insane perseverance. In 1875, he established the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh with money collected through mendicant tours, begging letters, and supplicant speeches. For Sayyid, politics was an unnecessary and undesirable encumbrance. The Muslims were under a cloud, the British frowned upon them, the Hindus were fast inheriting the intellectual and material superiority which not so long ago belonged to the Muslims. They were poorly equipped for political adventure, educationally and economically. They had reached their nadir. With such crippling handicaps, how could they dream of political agitation? They must keep themselves completely aloof from all political movements and devote themselves to educational uplift. When the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, Sayyid used every ounce of his influence, prestige and reputation in keeping the Muslims away from it. unless the Muslims had freed themselves of the suspicion of disloyalty and had educated themselves to the Hindu level. It was suicidal to join the Congress or any other political organization. Sayyid was so uncompromisingly critical of the Congress and its objectives as to declare that even if he heard that the Viceroy, the Secretary of State, and the whole House of Commons had declared for the Congress, he would remain firmly opposed to it. It is my definite belief, he said, that should the resolutions of the Native Congress be carried into effect, it would be impossible for the British government to preserve the peace or control in any degree the violence and civil war which would ensue. Converting the people to such a creed was an immense undertaking. For his pro-British attitude, Sayyid was dubbed a sycophant and dismissed as a toady. His enlightened views on education earned him the wrath of many a Muslim who passed fatwas, declaring that his innovations were corrupting the Muslim youth. For his criticism of the Congress, ardent Indian politicians poured contempt on him and charged him with harboring anti-democratic, anti-nationalist and pro-imperialist sentiments. But he preserved and continued to preach according to his convictions. Slowly but steadily, he gained converts to his cause, and before his death in 1898, he could, with satisfaction, look back along the lengthening track of life. Muslim India was yet not a nation by herself, nor did she claim such a title. But the Muslims had begun to look upon themselves as a separate entity, a different community, a group apart. This feeling of separateness from others and of oneness among themselves was the first foundation and the first symptom of Muslim nationalism in India. In future, whatever course the political developments took, there was only a remote possibility of a complete fusion of the Muslims and others. The work of Sayyid Ahmad Khan was carried forward by his colleagues and junior partners at Aligarh. Their combined efforts produced what is commonly known as the Aligarh movement. It was fundamentally a cultural movement aiming at the regeneration of liberal values in literature, social life, education and religion. In literature, it stood for simplicity of diction, purity of ideas, and an imitation of nature. Hali, the poet and literary critic, occupies in this respect the position enjoyed by Wordsworth in the Romantic revival of English poetry. In social matters, the Aligarhians strove for honesty in daily intercourse, communal sympathy, and the cultivation of unaffected habits. In education, the Aligarh College aspired to be a university, and in the meantime upheld Sayyid's ideal of a balance between the learning of the West and the mores of the East. In religion, the movement represented a shift towards reason and anti-fanaticism. The unhealthy influence of the half-educated mullah was counteracted by explaining in simple but elegant language the fundamental principles of Islam and by relating them to the sanction of human reason. The Aligarh movement was not short of human resources, and distinguished writers like Hali, Shibli, and Nazir Ahmad put their shoulders to its wheel. Sayyid Amir Ali was strictly speaking not of the movement, but he shared its ideals and in his own way furthered them. His Spirit of Islam was a new interpretation of Islam and Islamic history written with erudition and enthusiasm. His biography of the Prophet wielded great influence on the new generation of Indian Muslims, while his advocacy of such matters as female emancipation and the reform of Muhammadan personal law affected the community's thinking. The impact of this reformism was revolutionary. The Muslims developed a confidence in themselves and in their traditions. They came to respect themselves. The pessimism of the post-mutiny days gave way to what was almost a feeling of buoyancy. No longer was their loyalty questioned in British quarters. No longer did the Hindu dismiss them with a shake of the head. They were catching up in education. The Aligarh College was producing graduates who could fill the vacancies in government offices reserved for Muslims. They had begun to take an interest in trade and commerce and industry. Sayyid's policy was bearing fruit. Hope sprang in the hearts of men, and some leaders even began to think political thoughts. By the turn of the century, the Muslim community was pulsating with new ideas. Much had been achieved, though much remained undone. The old generation, which had tasted the bitter fruit of defeat and disgrace, was succeeded by a new generation, young in heart, fresh to the opportunities of life, aware of its solidarity and hopeful of the future. For them, the old injunction of aloofness from politics was losing its topical utility. events no longer justified it. The Hindus had organized a congress, formulated their demands, and made the British aware of their existence and their aspirations. Seeds of representative institutions sown by the Indian Council Act of 1892 might at any moment sprout into more far-reaching reforms. It was unwise to depend entirely upon the good opinion of the rulers, though it was a cause of much gratification. The age of political action was dawning, and those who did not see the signs of the time would be left behind. Muslims must organize themselves into a political movement, not only to consolidate what had been achieved, but also to make further advances and win new concessions from the powers that were, but traditions die hard. Some leaders, bred in the stable of Sayyid, still hesitated to take the plunge. The sage of Aligarh had uttered a ban on politics, and the ban must stand. The oracle had spoken, and his word was final. Events had yet to prove the invalidity of his admonition, and unless new portents appeared on the political horizon, no rash decision should be taken. Events in Bengal soon took the decision out of their hands. In October 1905, Lord Curzon, the masterful viceroy, announced and implemented a partition of Bengal with a dividing line between the Hindu West and the Muslim East. This harmless-looking administrative act and its consequences made the decision for the Muslims. Curzon's chief argument was that Bengal was too unwidely to be administered efficiently by one lieutenant governor. To those who wanted Bengal to be put under a governor and an executive council, he replied in a letter to the Secretary of State for India, "Government by one man is infinitely better than government by three men. It can be so managed. What we want in India is personal knowledge of localities and personal touch with the people. This can only be gained by the familiarity of the head of the administration with the places and people under his charge. With the triumvirate as a ruling power, this is quite impossible, and Bombay and Madras are both, in my view, illustrations that the weak points are in excess of the merit of the system." His original plan had been to take away one or two districts of Bengal and put them into the charge of the Assam Chief Commissionership. Later, he appreciated the force of the opposition to this scheme, and replying to the addresses presented to him during his Bengal tour of 1903-4, he clearly laid it down that he would consider the larger project of increasing the size of the territory to be cut away from Bengal and of creating a new province, large and important enough to have a lieutenant governor with a legislative council. The Secretary of State for India sanctioned this scheme in June 1905. Large territories were transferred from Bengal to the new province, which was given the official title of Eastern Bengal and Assam. It contained a population of 31 million people, of whom 18 million were Muslims and 12 million Hindus. Bengal was now left with 54 million inhabitants, of whom 42 million were Hindus and 9 million Muslims. In short, said the white paper, the territories now comprising Bengal and Assam will be divided into two compact and self-contained provinces, the largest constituent of which will be homogeneous in character and which will possess clearly defined boundaries and be equipped with the complete resources of an advanced administration. The proclamation of the formation of the new province was issued in September, and the province of Eastern Bengal and Assam formally came into being on 16 October 1905. The Hindus, particularly those of West Bengal, did not take kindly of this change. They charged the government with having favored the Muslims by giving them a province in which they formed a majority, having vivisected the Bengali homeland, having disrupted the Bengali nationality, and having injured the nationalist and patriotic movement and spirit of the people of India. The Bengali-speaking people were cut asunder. A deadly blow had been struck at the culture of Bengal, but contemporary evidence suggests that the Hindu opposition was not without ulterior motives. The partition was resented because the high caste Hindus desired to have the state of things which existed before the advent of the Muslims and of the low caste for the jobs. The educated Hindu feared that the creation of a Muslim majority province would tend to deprive him of his existing monopoly of influence and office. The new change had led to the development of Chittagong as a port, and the Hindus of Calcutta feared it as a possible rival. In brief, the Hindus, first of Bengal and later also of other provinces, objected to the creation of a Muslim majority province. The Muslims, on the other hand, rejoiced at the partition. 6 days after the partition was enforced, on 22 October 1905, a large Muslim meeting was held at Dhaka, at which the speaker impressed on the assembly the boon conferred on them by the change. On 24 October, another big gathering offered thanks to God that the partition had been carried into effect. Speeches dwelt on the many advantages to the Muslims, who through the division of Bengal would be spread many oppressions, which they had hitherto had to endure from the Hindus. On the first anniversary of the partition 1906, Muslims met throughout eastern Bengal to adopt a memorial to the Secretary of State for India expressing gratification that he had declared the partition to be a settled fact. The Muslim League, which had been formed in 1906, passed a resolution in September 1908, hoping that the government would adhere to this settled fact. The higher arose the crescendo of the anti-partition agitation, the greater was the apprehension of the Muslims lest the British government might surrender to the Hindu demand for a repeal of the partition. Therefore, not content with mere resolutions, the Muslim League sent a letter to the Under Secretary of State on 11th of November 1908, in which it expressed the grateful acknowledgement of the Muslims for the Secretary of State's intention not to interfere with the partition and warned that any change would cause serious dissatisfaction among the Muslims. One of the most effective weapons in the agitators' hands was the Swadeshi movement, or the boycott of all British-made goods. Hindus insisted that Muslims should also boycott foreign goods and refuse to sell them. This was distasteful and unacceptable to the Muslims, who had little sympathy with the agitation of which the boycott was one weapon and had no quarrel with the British or the textile manufacturers. Moreover, it was detrimental to their livelihood insofar as they lived on the trade in foreign clothes. When Hindus in their zeal on behalf of the agitation used physical coercion or intense social pressure on reluctant Muslim shopkeepers and traders, some sort of communal trouble was inevitable, as a Swadeshi or India-made article was often inferior to the foreign article in quality and higher in price. The poor Muslim naturally resented the sacrifice he has been compelled to make in the interest of an agitation that has no sympathy with. Further, the Muslims contended that under the old regime, when they were governed from Calcutta, they had no fair chance of progress. The Hindus, a minority in the total population, held 10 times as many appointments as the Muslims, 5 times as many Hindus held judicial posts, and they practically monopolized the bar. An unusually small proportion of European officials was appointed to the eastern district, with the result that Hindu officials ruled over overwhelmingly Muslim areas. Thus, the Muslims interpreted the Hindu agitation against the partition as nothing less than an attempt to maintain Hindu superiority over them in, among other things, public services. To the Hindu assertion that the partition cut at the root of Bengali nationality, it was pointed out that the word Bengal had no definite historical or geographical meaning before it was adopted by the British as a designation for a large administrative unit. The partition still kept Anga Banga together and segregated from them the Trans-Gangetic divisions of Bengal. Then there were precedents for divisions and mergers of Indian provinces when the populations affected by them had registered no protest. In 1892, Sir Charles Eliot, as the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, had advocated the cession of a part of the province of Assam. The Delhi division had been transferred to the Punjab. The Saugar and Narbada territories had been taken away from the northwestern provinces and added to the central provinces. Oath had been abolished as a separate unit and merged with the northwestern provinces. The small province of Khandesh had been twice partitioned between 1870 and 1899. In none of these cases had the people made any serious issue of the matter. This convinced the Muslims that the Hindu agitation for the modification of the partition was in its aim as much anti-Muslim as anti-British. An innocuous administrative decision had been made into something connected with the revolting ideas of matricide and decide. It appeared that the Hindus were not prepared to countenance the creation of a Muslim majority province. This, in the Muslim eyes, was very significant for it exposed the hollowness of the Congress claim that it stood for Hindu-Muslim unity and did not distinguish between a Hindu Indian and a Muslim Indian. It reinforced the Muslim feeling that their interests were not safe in Congress' hands, that they would never be treated fairly and justly by the Indian nationalists, and that any broad-based Indian nationalism was bound to be Hindu in character. The era of politics had set in, and it was no longer possible to shut one's eyes to political changes and keep traveling on the political path mapped out by Sayyid Ahmad Khan. This led straight to the idea of the establishment of a Muslim political organization. Another important factor contributed to this change in the climate of opinion. The principle of representation had been established in the provinces by the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Now rumor ran that this principle was to be extended to a wider field. Therefore, to safeguard their future interests, the Muslims drafted a plan of separate electorates and laid it before the Viceroy at Simla on 1 October 1906 through a representative deputation headed by the Agha Khan. The Simla deputation, as it generally called, argued for 2 points of policy. First, in all elections in the provinces and in local areas, Muslims should be represented by Muslims alone, and these representatives should be elected by purely Muslim electorates. Secondly, Muslims must have more seats and greater representation than their numerical strength, warranted because of their political importance and their greater contribution to the defense of the empire. The Viceroy in his reply agreed with the substance of the address and promised to recommend it to the Indian office. The gulf between the Hindus and Muslims, already widened by the Bengali agitation and its Hindu undercurrents, was now to manifest itself on the constitutional plane. The communal rift was becoming irrevocable. The beginning of politics. This long swing of events brought the Muslims face to face with the issue of political action. It was no longer possible to avoid politics, for the march of events had already pushed them into the arms of constitutional agitation. They could not join the Congress because, in the words of a Muslim leader of the time, tied to the wheels of the Juggernaut, a majority, they would in the end be crushed out of the semblance of nationality. They espoused a new aggressive attitude among the Hindus. A contemporary Hindu observer noted that it was from the end of 1906 that the Hindus became conscious of a new kind of hatred for the Muslims. We began to hear angry comment in the mouths of the elders that the Muslims were coming out quite openly in favor of partition, and on the side of the English, a cold dislike for the Muslims settled down in our hearts, putting an end to all real intimacy of relationship. Between 1902 and 1905, Muslim leaders had made some attempts to negotiate with Hindu politicians. The Agha Khan had remonstrated with Sir Feroz Shah Mehta about the necessity of persuading the Congress to gain Muslim confidence. When these efforts failed, it was felt that the only hope lay in the establishment of a Muslim political body to secure independent political recognition from the British government as a nation within a nation. The All India Muslim League was accordingly established in December 1906 at a meeting of Muslim leaders in Dhaka. The Muslim League was thus the child of 4 factors. First, the old belief uttered by Sayyid Ahmad Khan that the Muslims were somehow a separate entity. Secondly, the Hindu character of the Indian National Congress, which did not allow the Muslims to associate themselves with other Indians. Thirdly, the agitation against the partition of Bengal, which conveyed to the Muslims and the Hindu designs of domination. And finally, the Muslims desired to have their own exclusive electorates for all representative institutions. The years 1906 to 11 constitute a period in which the Hindu-Muslim rift continued to widen and deepen almost beyond repair. On the Hindu side, these years were big with the anti-British and anti-Muslim agitation in Bengal and other parts of India. Tilak was the most prominent leader who, by his orthodox religious views and belligerent political action, alienated the Muslims from the mainstream of Indian nationalism and renewed their faith in the British. On the Muslim side, these years saw the foundation of the Muslim League. The establishment of separate Muslim electorates and the beginning of the feeling that Muslim interests lay in continued cooperation with the British and in severe aloofness from the Congress. The path of Muslim policy during these turbulent years is well delineated in the Agha Khan's letter of September 1908, addressed to the Deccan Provincial Muslim League. British rule not only a titular sovereignty, but a vigorous force permeating every branch of the administration, is an absolute necessity. Therefore, I put it to you that it is the duty of all true Indian patriots to make that rule strong. This is a duty which lies not only upon Muslims, but equally upon the Parsis, the Sikhs, upon all who are convinced of the benevolence of British rule. These are the patriotic ideas which I think should animate the Muslim community at the present juncture. Ours must be not a lukewarm patriotism, no passive, unemotional acquiescence in the established order. It must be a living, controlling, vitalizing force, guiding all our actions, shaping all our ideals. Rather should it be our task to persuade by precept and example those Hindus who have strayed from the path of true progress to return to it. By and large, this advice was followed by Muslim India. Only a few Muslims joined the Congress, and they did not represent the mainstream of Muslim feeling. British rule was stoutly defended and bravely supported. The countenance of the partition of Bengal and the grant of separate electorates were made the central issues on which the Muslims tested the British recognition of their loyalty. Muslim leadership of the time was of a high order and succeeded in influencing the British government in Muslim favor. In Britain, the Aga Khan and Amir Ali did yeoman service to the Muslim cause, and it was mostly due to their efforts that the partition of Bengal was allowed to stand, and Muslim prayer for separate representation was answered by the Morley Minto reforms of 1909. In India, the Muslims were trusted and respected by the imperial rulers. It was a comforting thought that their aspirations were not disregarded and that their loyalty was appreciated. The Anglo-Muslim amity was as mutual as it was deep. These halcyon days were brought to an abrupt end by the repeal of the partition of Bengal. The new province of Eastern Bengal and Assam had been making good progress. Its administration was firmly established and its economy was showing steady improvement. The agitation was admitted by the government to be dead. The general condition of law and order was gratifying. Political crime had greatly diminished. The vernacular press no longer reeked of sedition. And outrages were more infrequent than at any time during the previous 5 years. The authorities were said to be too firmly convinced of the administrative value of the division to attempt any modification. Any reversal of policy was liable to bring dangerous results. Nevertheless, in December 1911, the partition was annulled. Lord Hardinge, who had succeeded Minto as Viceroy on 23 November 1910, wrote to the Secretary of State for India on 25 August 1911 that the partition was resented by the Bengalis, though he confessed that the Muslims had benefited by it and were loyal and contented. He suggested a modification of the partition based on two conditions. First, it should duly safeguard the interests of Eastern Bengal and generally conciliate Muslim sentiment. Secondly, it should be so clearly based on broad grounds of political and administrative expediency as to negative any presumption that it had been extorted by clamor or agitation. Muslim interests were to be safeguarded by the special representation they enjoyed in the Legislative Council. His scheme was to reunite the 5 Bengali-speaking divisions, an administrative area into which provinces were divided, into a presidency administered by a governor and council, to create a lieutenant governorship and council of Bihar, Chota Nagpur and Odisha, and to restore the chief commissionership of Assam. Simultaneously, the capital of India was to be shifted from Calcutta to Delhi. Action on these lines, he claimed, would be a bold stroke of statesmanship and would open a new era in the history of India. The Marquess of Crewe's reply was phrased in equally enthusiastic terms. Giving his immediate sanction to the Viceroy's scheme, he wrote on 1 November 1911, "I cannot recall in history, nor can I picture in any portion of the civilized world as it exists, a series of administrative changes of so wide a scope." The decision was announced by the king in person at the coronation Darbar at Delhi on 12 December 1911. Muslim reaction to this change was dumbfounded astonishment and bitter soreness. It gave rise to a feeling of distrust in the future promises and actions of the government. It irritated the Muslims who believed that they had been sacrificed to appease the Hindus. It alienated them and weakened their trust in British stability of purpose. It was a lesson that loyalty paid no dividends, that the government listened only to agitation and sedition, and that the Muslims had been foolishly wrong in believing in British sincerity. Bombs alone led to boons. The failure of the Muslim policy of loyalty was proved to be as signal as the triumph of the Hindu policy of contumacy. Hardinge was right, though unwittingly in telling Crewe that his scheme would open a new era in Indian history. For the Muslims, it heralded a new age of intense political consciousness and activity. A marked change came over their politics. They began to feel deeply that the government was unable to unprepared to protect their rights. Official promises could no longer be trusted. The policy of sturdy loyalty, practiced in the face of Hindu jeers, had brought no reward. Their first gesture of challenge was a resolution passed by the Muslim League at its annual session held in December 1912. January 1913, changing the League's aim from loyalty to a form of self-government suitable to India. Suitable is the operative word, for the Muslims still refused to identify themselves with the Congress demand for unqualified self-government. They retained the right to modify self-rule in accordance with their needs and aspirations. This amendment in the constitution of the League seems to have conveyed, at least to some minds in Britain, the impression that Muslims are no longer loyal. To answer such reflections cast on their attitude, and to clarify the situation arising out of their new aims and ideals, a Muslim deputation went to England towards the end of 1913 to apprise the ministers and other officials of the essential feeling of the community, but the Secretary of State refused to receive it on the ground that an interview would be misunderstood by the other Muslims who claimed equally with the Muslim League to represent the political temper of Muslim India. Obviously, Crewe was thinking of such loyalists as the Aga Khan, whose traditional loyalty to Britain did not permit them to cooperate with the League after 1911, and who shortly afterwards left its fold, giving place to others better equipped to lead the community in changed circumstances. From 1858 to 1905, the Muslims had been cultivating the British. From 1906 to 1911, this amity blossomed in friendship. From 1911 to 1922, their relations may be described as ranging from an armed truce to open warfare. This evolution may also be expressed in another way. From 1858 to 1905, the Muslims stood outside the political arena. From 1906 to 1911, they were schooling themselves in constitution politics. From 1911 onwards, they, or at least most of them, were agitators, preaching with full-throated ease the gospel of disorder and sedition. There is still another way of describing this development. From 1858 to 1905, the Muslims were in a state of neutrality vis-a-vis the Hindus from 1906 to 1911. The Hindu-Muslim rift was first marked and later ominous from 1911 to 1922. The two communities cooperated against what they considered a common enemy, Britain. This entente produced quick results. The Muslim League and the Congress met a joint session in 1916 at Lucknow and formulated the common reform proposals to be put before the government for immediate implementation. By the terms of this Lucknow Pact, the League, besides endorsing the Congress demands, resolved to send a deputation to England immediately after the war to present the Indian claims in cooperation with a similar deputation from the Congress. In its next session at Calcutta on 31 December 1917, the League endorsed the Congress resolution urging the necessity of a parliamentary statute containing complete responsible government. But it stipulated three conditions: A. Adequate Muslim representation in councils, public services and universities. B. No displacement of Persian characters from the Urdu language. And C. No interference with the Eid Zuha and Muharram festivals. The Lucknow Pact is of outstanding importance in the development of Indian Muslim nationalism for two reasons. It was the first Hindu-Muslim compact in modern Indian history, and in the hopes of several leaders on both sides, was expected to lay the foundation of a permanent united action against the British. It was also the first and the only occasion when the Hindus not only conceded separate electorates to Muslims but agreed to the quantum of Muslim representation in different provincial legislatures. And at the center, though some prominent figures in both camps criticized the nature and terms of the Concordat, yet there is no doubt that for the nascent Muslim nationalism, it was for the moment a victory without qualifications, though, as will be seen later, a victory of doubtful ultimate advantage to bring round the Congress which had been bitterly condemning separate electorates. Since 1906, to their point of view, was no mean achievement for the Muslims, but as we will see in the next chapter, it was not so much the genius of Muslim leadership as a fortuitous constellation of circumstances which brought forth this unique turn of events. The Congress League scheme of reforms was, however, not only far ahead of the times, but in fact did not aim at realizing responsible government. It contented itself with leaving an irremovable executive at the mercy of a legislature which could paralyze it without directing it. The official reply to the Lucknow Agreement was contained in the famous Montagu announcement of 20 August 1917. The pith and substance of which was the sentence, "The policy of His Majesty's government with which the government of India are in complete accord is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration, and the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire." This sentiment was soon given a practical shape when Montagu visited India from November 1917 to April 1918, and in cooperation with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, held discussions with Indian leaders of all opinions. The result of these conversations and the Viceroy, Secretary of State deliberations was the Montagu-Chelmsford report, which was published on 8 July 1918. The proposals of the report were supported by all the members of the Council, of the Secretary of State and of the Viceroy's Executive Council, and were welcomed by the non-official members of the Imperial Legislative Council, but were severely criticized by the Muslim League and the Congress. The report's plan was so far removed from that of the Congress League scheme that no attempt was made to arrange a compromise, and the official recommendations were drafted into a Government of India bill, which passed through Parliament in 1919 and received the royal assent on 23 December. The Act gave separate representation to the Muslims and also extended it to one other minority, the Sikhs. Here we must break our chronological order and go back a little to take notice of another important development. Besides the repeal of the partition of Bengal, there was another factor equally or perhaps even more deeply responsible for the anti-British feeling of the Muslims from 1912 onwards. This was the Khilafat issue. It is studied in great detail in the chapter on the religious factor, but here a short reference to it is in order to make the story clear. Briefly, the Indian Khilafat movement was a purely Muslim campaign in favor of Turkey and her Sultan. The Muslims felt that the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, the only surviving Muslim independent country, must be maintained at all costs. This was predominantly a political feeling, though with a not inconsiderable religious basis, but added to this was a purely religious sentiment, which looked at the Turkish Sultan as the Khalifa of the Muslims of the world, and which therefore interpreted any diminution of his authority as an assault upon the sovereignty of the supreme Islamic personality. The Turco-Italian War of 1912, the Balkan Wars of 1912, the Turkish participation in the Great War on the side of the Central Powers, and the defeat of Turkey in 1918, these developments were actually embarrassing to Muslim India. Circumstances seemed to conspire to doom the tradition of loyalty. The Muslims, on the strength of their friendship with Britain, expected in 1912 that Whitehall would help Turkey. When they were disappointed in this hope, they related it to the Delhi Darbar decision, put two and two together, and concluded that Britain was deliberately trying to crush the Muslims in India as well as elsewhere. The Balkan and the Great War strengthened this belief, and at the end of the hostilities, when the Allies forced the Treaty of Sevres on the tottering Ottoman edifice, Muslims got wild with anger. treason was openly preached, and the anti-British sentiment reached a pitch of extremity unmatched in the history of British rule in India. The pressure was so intense that the British government had to revise its attitude and to give in to Indian feeling. The Treaty of Lausanne, which replaced the severe and stern Treaty of Sevres, satisfied the Indian Muslims, though this satisfaction was short-lived. When Mustafa Kemal abolished the institution of Khilafat and a little later the Sultanate monarchy itself, there was disappointment among the Indian Muslims and panic among the Orthodox. But of this more later. From our point of view, the importance of the Khilafat lay in two things. It was anti-British, and it was at least temporarily and on the surface a further bond between the Hindus and the Muslims. It had to be anti-British for Turkey and fought Britain, and Britain was on the dictating side in the peace negotiations. What is interesting is that the bulk of the Hindus led by Gandhi made a common cause with the Muslims and fully participated in the extremist agitation of 1919 to 21. The spirit of Lucknow was yet strong, and the British rejection of the Congress League scheme of reform strengthened the strands of unity. Hindu-Muslim fraternity manifested itself on all levels. Politically, the two communities had practically coalesced and for the first time forged a united front against the British. Religiously, the Hindus had shown great tactical skill in espousing the alien and purely Islamic cause of Khilafat. Socially, the Hindus and Muslims are now brethren unto each other, and all sorrows and triumphs were equally shared. So solid and strong was the new friendship that some Hindu religious leaders who had a little earlier been castigated as unpardonable enemies of Islam were now invited by the Muslims to preach from the pulpit of the Royal Mosque of Delhi. Solidarity born of expediency could go no further. Moral, my enemy's enemy is my friend. But those who had let themselves be dazzled by this show of unity and had predicted a long life for it were proved false prophets. Even when the Lucknow Compact was yet quite fresh, Hindu-Muslim riots reared their ugly head. Patna passed into the hands of Hindu mobs and heads were broken with lethal avidity. The government resolution on these disturbances minced no words and declared that for the like of such bloodshed, one had to go back to 1857. Innumerable minor riots followed, but the limit was reached in 1921 when there was a communal explosion in Malabar. The Moplas of that area, mostly primitive Muslims of mixed Arab descent, fell upon the Hindus who lived amongst them and tore them to pieces. So fierce and widespread was the onslaught that the army had to be called in, and for many months Malabar lived under martial law. At one fell stroke, the carefully nurtured unity was shot to ribbons. Never again were the two nations to come together in any sphere of life. The spirit of Lucknow was irrevocably dead. Was this orgy of religious strife connected with the 1919 reforms? Some thought so, and their main argument was that the provision of separate electorates was responsible for the aggravation. But this provision was not new and had dated from 1909. It could also be argued that the abrogation of communal representation would provoke still more violent friction. On the larger question, whether any future reforms were at all possible in view of Indian disunity, the Times comment was both wise and prescient. The next installment of reforms should continue to safeguard the rights of religious and political minorities and to maintain the reserved powers of the provincial governments. To those who took this to be a reactionary thought, the journal addressed the pertinent question, will Indian nationhood be advanced by presenting powerful minorities with potent grievances, or by seeking to deprive the executive of the authority necessary to preserve Indian political unity until Indian national union became a plain and irrefutable fact?